Alex and Rico were what most people would call a normal couple. They lived in a bustling, progressive city, one where tolerance was as common as morning coffee. The kind of city where rainbow flags hung from every storefront and pride parades flooded the streets in vivid displays of acceptance. Alex and Rico fit right in, an average couple with a shared love for weekend brunches, spontaneous road trips, and quiet evenings in front of Netflix. There was nothing extraordinary about their lives, except for the love they had for each other. And that was enough. On the surface, they seemed content. They were comfortable in their own skin, confident in their relationship. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, a quiet discomfort, like an itch they couldn't scratch. They had recently begun attending LGBTQ+ events, trying to become more involved in the movement, but they were beginning to feel like outsiders in a community that preached inclusivity. There were moments when Alex and Rico exchanged glances, the kind that spoke volumes without saying a word. They weren't sure if they fully understood the direction the LGBTQ+ movement was heading in, at least, not the way some of its more vocal advocates saw it. The movement had always been about acceptance, right? But now it felt like there were new rules, ones that were being enforced with the kind of certainty that left no room for debate. As they sat at a local LGBTQ+ meetup, surrounded by passionate voices rallying for change, Alex couldn't help but feel the weight of the expectations pressing down on him. People spoke of radical activism, of taking things further, faster, louder. It wasn't enough to just be gay anymore. To be truly accepted in the movement, you had to wear your identity on your sleeve and constantly challenge everything around you. You had to be an activist, not just a participant. Alex and Rico, in their quiet suburban life, weren't sure they were cut out for this kind of activism. The discomfort was mutual. Rico, usually the more laid back of the two, found himself growing uneasy at the constant pressure to conform to an ever-evolving definition of what it meant to be progressive. The idea that their peaceful, loving relationship could somehow be seen as too traditional gnawed at him. He didn't want to feel like he was failing the cause, but every conversation seemed to push them further away from the radical ideals that were being preached. They didn't want to be judged for not living up to someone else's version of what it meant to be gay, to be in a relationship. They were just two people in love, trying to navigate a world that seemed to demand more and more of them with each passing day. But the tension was building, and they both knew it. The question was no longer if they would be called out, but when. Jordan was a force. A name that had become synonymous with the kind of radical activism that left no room for hesitation. When they entered a room, the energy shifted. The kind of person who had a presence that demanded attention, even without saying a word. Tall, confident, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through the surface and into the heart of anyone they spoke to. Jordan didn't just participate in the LGBTQ+ movement, they were a juggernaut in it, pushing boundaries at every turn, challenging norms with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her pride. Word had spread about Jordan's unyielding stance on progressive causes. They were a leader, no, an icon, for those who believed that the fight for LGBTQ+ rights didn't stop at just the legal battles or acceptance in mainstream society. No, Jordan believed in complete and total upheaval. If you weren't actively dismantling systems of oppression, if you weren't challenging every uncomfortable truth, you weren't doing enough. Jordan's social media was a battleground of ideas, where every post was a manifesto. Their followers idolized them, hanging on every word, every call to action. They had become the ultimate authority on what it meant to be woke, and if you didn't measure up to their standards, you were deemed complicit in the very systems they were fighting to overthrow. To some, Jordan was a hero, a person who wasn't afraid to speak the unspoken, to call out the hypocrisies that others were too scared to address. To others, they were a walking nightmare, a person who seemed to have no tolerance for anything less than absolute perfection in the fight for progress. And that was exactly the kind of advocate Alex and Rico had heard about. It was at one of the LGBTQ+ community events that they first saw Jordan in person. The room fell silent as Jordan entered, their very presence commanding attention. Dressed in a leather jacket with an LGBTQ+ pride patch on the sleeve, their look was as sharp as their words. Jordan exuded a kind of rebellious energy, like someone who had rejected every convention and was now creating their own. As Jordan took the stage to speak, there was an undeniable magnetism in the way they carried themselves. Their voice was calm, but each sentence hit with the precision of a carefully placed blow. There was no room for ambiguity in Jordan's message. If we're going to truly change the world, they began, we need to stop pretending that our comfort zones will get us there. The world doesn't change by simply fitting in. It changes when we burn the old systems to the ground and build something better. It wasn't just the words that resonated, it was the certainty in Jordan's eyes. They were unflinching, unwavering in their belief that activism wasn't just an optional pursuit, it was a full-time commitment. There were no shortcuts, no compromises. Anything less than full immersion in the struggle for change was an act of betrayal. Alex felt a pang of discomfort as they listened. There was something electrifying about Jordan's conviction, but there was also a part of him that wondered, was this what they were supposed to aspire to? Was this the price of being a part of this community? Jordan was unapologetic, yes, but also unforgiving, a reminder that if you weren't pushing hard enough, you weren't enough. The meeting was held in a small, dimly lit community space downtown, its walls adorned with posters of marches, protests, and powerful slogans. Alex and Rico entered the room with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. This was their chance to dive deeper into the movement, to hear from the people shaping its future. But as they settled into their seats, an unease began to settle in their chests. The group was large, nearly 30 people, all huddled in a circle, each person eager to contribute their voice. There was a palpable energy in the room, but it wasn't the kind of energy that made Alex feel inspired. It was the kind that made him feel small, like he was standing in a storm, watching the winds whip around him while he was too afraid to speak. He could feel the eyes of the room, some expecting him to be just as outspoken, just as fervent as everyone else. Jordan was there, of course, at the front of the room, already setting the tone. Their presence was magnetic, unavoidable. They didn't just lead, they commanded, their eyes scanning the group as they spoke with the kind of certainty that could silence any doubts. "We are at a crossroads," Jordan began, their voice cutting through the room. "This is no longer just about equality. This is about disruption. Change doesn't happen by playing nice with systems of oppression. It happens when we refuse to accept anything less than radical transformation." As the words hung in the air, Alex glanced over at Rico. There was a nervousness in Rico's eyes that mirrored his own. They had both been raised in a world that told them progress was a slow, steady climb, a process of incremental change, not sudden, all-encompassing upheaval. But here, in this room, the message was clear: if you weren't radical enough, you weren't doing enough. One by one, members of the group began speaking, each one more fervent than the last. Their words were sharp, angry, demanding. They spoke of holding corporations accountable, of tearing down the capitalist structure, of rejecting all forms of mainstream acceptance. They spoke as if there were only one way to be an ally, one way to fight for change: total, unapologetic rebellion. Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He believed in the cause, believed in fighting for equality, for respect. But was this what it meant to be an ally? To stand at the front lines of a revolution, armed with slogans and anger, never questioning whether the fight had room for people like him? His heart began to race. Was he being passive? Was he not doing enough? The words of Jordan echoed in his mind: anything less than full immersion in the struggle is an act of betrayal. Rico was quieter than usual, his brows furrowed in thought. Alex could tell he was struggling with the same questions. Were they doing enough? Was their relatively quiet, peaceful existence a betrayal of the very people they wanted to support? They had always been the type of couple who believed in small, consistent acts of change, advocating for equality in their everyday lives, speaking up when they could, donating to causes. But here, in this room, their brand of activism felt inadequate, almost meaningless. Jordan continued to speak, their words growing more forceful. "It's not enough to wear a rainbow flag or tweet a hashtag. It's not enough to simply say you support us. You need to make people uncomfortable. You need to force them to question everything. And if you're not ready to do that, maybe you're not ready for the fight." Alex could feel his stomach tighten. It was clear now, they weren't just being asked to support the cause. They were being asked to embody it in its most radical, uncompromising form. And in that moment, He wondered if they were the ones who had gotten it all wrong. Had they been too comfortable? Too content? Was it possible that the price of acceptance in this community was higher than they were willing to pay? The room had fallen into a heavy silence, the kind that only comes when something uncomfortable is about to happen. Alex felt the weight of Jordan's gaze on him, as if the air itself was thickening, each word carrying the weight of judgment. They had spent the last few hours listening, nodding, agreeing, absorbing the intensity of the conversation. But now, it felt as though the spotlight had shifted, and Alex wasn't sure he liked where it was heading. Jordan's voice sliced through the tension. "I've been hearing a lot of talk about support and allies tonight," they began, their tone calm, but there was a certain sharpness to it. "But what I haven't heard enough of is real, radical action. This movement isn't about sitting comfortably on the sidelines, it's about burning down the system and rebuilding it from the ground up. So, tell me, Alex and Rico, are you ready to stand up and fight, or are you just here for the easy ride?" Alex's heart skipped a beat. His palms felt suddenly clammy. He exchanged a quick glance with Rico, whose face had gone pale. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected to be singled out, not like this. Jordan's eyes locked onto them, unwavering. "I've seen you two at every event, nodding along, smiling, sharing your stories," Jordan continued, their voice rising, each word more pointed than the last. "But I haven't seen you do anything more than talk. Is that really enough? Are you truly committed to this cause, or are you just pretending to be?" The words hit like a punch, and Alex felt a sudden rush of heat flood his face. He wanted to argue, to explain that they had always been supportive, that they had always tried to do their part, in their own way. But the way Jordan's words stung, the venom behind them, made it difficult to find his voice. Rico spoke first, his voice quiet but firm. "We're doing what we can. We've always supported the movement in our own way. Just because we don't shout the loudest or wave the biggest banner doesn't mean we're not involved." Jordan didn't flinch. "That's the problem," they shot back, their voice now cutting through the air like a blade. "You think supporting the movement is enough by just being there, by being passive. You think you can sit in the comfort of your own little lives and just support from the sidelines. Well, that's not how change happens. It happens when you fight. When you get uncomfortable. When you put everything on the line. And right now, you're too comfortable. Too silent." Alex felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the way Jordan had painted them as the enemy. As if their mere existence, their moderate approach to change, was a betrayal to everything the movement stood for. He could feel the weight of the group's eyes on them now, the judgment, the silent approval or disapproval of Jordan's words. He wanted to defend himself, to say that change wasn't just about anger and rebellion, it was also about consistent, quiet actions that built momentum over time. But the words wouldn't come. Rico, usually the more patient of the two, clenched his fists. "That's not fair," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and frustration. "You're making it sound like we don't care. Like we're not part of the fight just because we don't want to tear everything down." Jordan's lips curled into a slight smirk, a look of cold amusement. "You can't fight change if you're not willing to destroy the status quo," they said, their voice now dripping with disdain. "And right now, you're clinging to it like a safety net. You're too afraid to burn it down and build something better. That's not progressive, that's just comfortable." Alex felt his stomach churn. It wasn't just the harshness of Jordan's criticism, it was the weight of the expectation that they should be more, do more, live more radically. Was this what it meant to truly be progressive? Was this the price of belonging to the community? The feeling of inadequacy was suffocating. Rico turned to Alex, his expression tense. "I don't think I can do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising hum of voices in the room. "I don't think I can live up to this." Alex didn't know how to respond. He had always believed that they were enough in their love, enough in their fight for equality, enough in their dedication to the cause. But here, in this room, it felt like enough wasn't close to being enough. The drive home was heavy with silence, the weight of Jordan's words hanging between them like a fog they couldn't shake off. Alex gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, eyes fixed ahead but seeing nothing. Rico sat beside him, his gaze cast out the window, lost in thought. Neither of them knew how to bridge the growing gap that had opened between them in that room. The same gap that now seemed to stretch between them and the community they had once felt so welcomed by. When they pulled into the driveway, neither moved to get out of the car. The world outside felt distant, as if they were floating, detached from everything they had known. It wasn't just the criticism they'd faced, it was the sudden, overwhelming realization that they didn't belong in the world they had fought so hard to be a part of. Do you think Jordan was right? Rico asked, his voice quieter than Alex had ever heard it. Alex hesitated. It wasn't the question itself that made him pause, it was the way it made everything they had built together feel fragile, as though their shared understanding of their place in the movement was now in jeopardy. I don't know, Alex admitted. Maybe. But I don't think we should have to change who we are to fit in. I don't think our kind of support is any less valid. Rico nodded slowly, but there was doubt in his eyes. It just feels like we're being told that being quiet, being moderate, isn't enough. Like we're supposed to be shouting from the rooftops, destroying everything in sight, or we're not really part of it. Alex felt a pang of frustration. But that's not what it's about. It's not about tearing everything down, it's about making people see us, making them respect us. Why can't that be enough? Rico was silent for a long moment. I don't know anymore, Alex. I don't know if it's enough. The way they talk, the way they act, it's like if we're not radical enough, we're complicit. Like we're letting everyone down just by being ourselves. The words hung in the air like a noxious cloud, suffocating the room. Alex felt the tightness in his chest again, the old familiar feeling of being judged for not being enough. The pressure to be more than they were, to fit into a box that wasn't theirs to begin with, was overwhelming. He had always believed that their quiet, everyday activism was meaningful, that small, consistent actions were just as powerful as big, loud protests. But now, in the wake of Jordan's criticism, it felt like that wasn't enough. Nothing they did seemed to matter unless it was loud, aggressive, uncompromising. What if they're right? Rico whispered, the vulnerability in his voice cutting through Alex like a knife. Alex wanted to say something, anything, that would put this doubt to rest. But the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know what the movement was anymore. He didn't know if he was doing enough, if he was enough. He didn't know if they could even continue to be a part of it without changing who they were, without surrendering their own values in exchange for acceptance. I don't want to change who we are, Alex said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't want to become something we're not just to belong. But maybe we've been fooling ourselves. Maybe the fight we're in isn't the same one we thought it was. Rico met his gaze, his face a mixture of frustration and sadness. Maybe we don't belong in this fight, not in the way they want us to. Maybe we've been trying to play someone else's game all along. The words stung. Alex wasn't ready to accept that they didn't belong, that their way of fighting, small, steady, and often quiet, wasn't enough, but the reality was undeniable. Every moment they spent in this new, radicalized space, they felt more and more like outsiders. The question was, could they live with that? Could they live with being told they weren't doing enough, that their contribution to the movement didn't matter? As the silence stretched between them, Alex realized that the hardest part wasn't facing the judgment of others, it was confronting the judgment they had started to feel about themselves, and in that moment, he wasn't sure if they could find a way to reconcile those two worlds. The following morning, the weight of the previous night's conversation still hung heavy between Alex and Rico. The silence was thick, each one of them wrapped in their own thoughts, unsure of where to go from here. Rico had barely spoken since their argument in the car, his eyes distant and troubled. Alex, too, was struggling to find the right words, unsure of how to fix the rift that had suddenly appeared in their relationship and in their connection to the community they had so long believed in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rico broke the silence. Maybe we should just walk away, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I can't keep pretending like this is the fight we signed up for. I can't keep fighting for something that doesn't feel like us anymore. Alex turned to him, heart sinking at the finality in his words. Rico, he started, but his voice faltered. What do you mean? You want to leave the movement? The cause? Rico shook his head slowly. I don't know what we're part of anymore. I don't even know what it means to be a part of it. It's like there's only one way to be, one way to fight, and we don't fit in that mold. We've been made to feel like we're not doing enough, that our way of supporting isn't radical enough. His voice cracked, a rare vulnerability breaking through his usual calm. Maybe it's time we admit that we don't belong in this version of it. I don't want to feel like I'm not enough, Alex. I'm tired of feeling like I'm being punished for not being extreme enough. Alex felt a surge of guilt, but something deeper stirred within him too, a sense of longing, of quiet rebellion against the suffocating pressure to conform. He didn't want to give up on the movement, but he wasn't ready to abandon who they were in the process. I get it, Alex said softly, his eyes meeting Rico's. I really do. But what if? What if we've been thinking about this all wrong? What if the fight isn't just about radical change at all costs, but about the space we create for everyone to participate in their own way? Rico frowned, clearly still unsure. What do you mean? I mean, maybe it's not just about loud protests and tearing things down, Alex continued, his voice gaining strength. Maybe the movement needs to be more than just that. Maybe it's about the diversity of thought, about finding a way to honor all the different kinds of progress we can make, without being forced into a single, narrow definition of what activism looks like. Rico's eyes softened, though the doubt didn't fully disappear. So you think there's a place for us in all of this? Even if we're not, shouting for change? Alex nodded, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. I do. We can fight for change in our own way, without losing ourselves. We don't have to fit into a mold just to be accepted. There's space in the LGBTQ+ community for all kinds of voices. We don't need to be radical to be powerful. We're allowed to define what activism means to us. It doesn't have to be their way. The realization was slow but liberating. The more Alex spoke, the more he felt a sense of relief settle in his chest. He could still be a part of the movement, but it didn't mean he had to sacrifice his authenticity. He could support the cause without losing sight of who he was, without compromising their own values. Rico's expression softened, the tension slowly draining from his face. You're right, he said quietly. Maybe we've been too hard on ourselves. Maybe we've been trying to fit into something that wasn't meant for us, but that doesn't mean we're not part of the fight. We just have to find our own way. Alex smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. Exactly. Our way is enough. We don't have to destroy everything to make a difference. And in that moment, a quiet sense of peace settled between them. They weren't giving up, they were just finding a different path. One that allowed them to stay true to who they were, without compromising the fight for equality and acceptance that they both still believed in. They didn't have to conform to the radical expectations of others to make a difference, they just had to be themselves. Alex and Rico didn't have to say much to each other when they decided to confront Jordan. The weight of the decision hung between them, but there was no more avoiding it. They couldn't shake the feeling of being alienated by the very community they wanted to belong to, and if they didn't speak up now, the discomfort would fester. They had to face Jordan, to tell them what they had been holding in since that meeting, how the constant pressure to conform was tearing at them, making them question everything they stood for. They found Jordan at a local cafe, the kind of place where activists and creatives often gathered, their laptops open and their fingers flying across keyboards. Jordan sat at a corner table, sipping coffee and typing away on their phone, seemingly unfazed by the world around them. When they noticed Alex and Rico approach, their eyes lit up, but the warmth quickly turned to something more guarded, more expectant. So, you've come to talk, Jordan said, looking up from their phone. Their voice was smooth, but there was a sharpness to it, as if they already knew what was coming. What's on your minds? Rico didn't waste any time. We need to talk about what happened at the meeting, he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of frustration. You made us feel like we weren't doing enough. Like we weren't progressive enough to even be a part of this movement. Jordan raised an eyebrow, not surprised, but intrigued. And what exactly is it that you feel you're not doing? What's the problem with challenging your own comfort zone? Alex took a deep breath, his heart pounding. The problem is that we don't think radical activism is the only way to make change, he said, his voice steady but his nerves beginning to show. We believe in the cause, We always have. But you made us feel like we weren't enough just because we don't conform to your version of what it means to be an ally. We don't want to be loud. We don't want to burn everything down. We want to make change in our own way, quietly, consistently. And that should be enough. Jordan's eyes flickered with something, amusement, maybe, or perhaps just a recognition that they weren't going to be able to steamroll this conversation. And what if your way isn't enough? What if you're not doing enough to push this movement forward? Do you really think the fight for equality is won through small, comfortable actions? Rico clenched his fists, but Alex put a hand on his arm, trying to stay calm. We're not saying that we don't believe in progress, Alex countered. We're saying that change doesn't always have to be loud or radical. It can be quiet, personal, and still have an impact. You're forcing us into a box, telling us that if we're not as extreme as you want us to be, we're not part of the fight. But that's not the kind of activism we believe in. Jordan leaned back in their chair, eyes narrowing slightly. I get it. You want to be comfortable. But comfort doesn't change the world. Radical change does. And if you're not willing to challenge everything, your own identity, your own privilege, then maybe you're part of the problem. Alex's frustration flared. So, according to you, we're not allowed to define our own role in the movement? We're not allowed to have our own voice unless it fits your idea of what progress looks like. Jordan paused for a moment, and for the first time, Alex saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes. That's not what I meant, Jordan said, a little quieter now. But I do believe we have to push for real change. If we're not challenging ourselves to be uncomfortable, to be radical, then we're just playing into the hands of the system we're trying to tear down. This fight isn't just about acceptance, it's about revolution. Rico leaned forward, his voice sharp. But revolution doesn't mean forcing everyone to be the same, to act the same. It means there's space for all of us to fight in our own way. Not everyone is going to show up the same way you do, and that's okay. There's room for diversity in this movement, Jordan. We can't all be radical, but that doesn't make us any less committed. Jordan looked at them both, their expression shifting, perhaps understanding something they hadn't before. I get it, they said finally, their voice softer. Maybe I've been too hard on you both. I get so wrapped up in what should be happening that I forget there's room for different ways to fight. Alex nodded, feeling the tension lift slightly. We all fight differently. And we have every right to define what activism looks like for us, just like you do for yourself. The conversation wasn't resolved, and the questions still lingered. But for the first time, Alex and Rico felt heard. They weren't the problem. They weren't failing the movement. They just needed to find their own place within it. And maybe, just maybe, Jordan needed to recognize that everyone's fight looked different. Alex and Rico sat on their couch that evening, the warm glow of their living room lamp casting soft shadows across the room. The weight of the conversation with Jordan was still with them, but now it felt different. The tension that had been building between them, the anxiety about not fitting into the mold of what it meant to be a true activist, had started to dissolve. For the first time in days, they could breathe again. They had talked long into the night, trying to piece together everything they'd been feeling. Rico had voiced his frustration, his fear of being too passive, too comfortable. But it was Alex who had made the breakthrough, who had finally said what they both needed to hear. They didn't have to change who they were to belong. I think we've been going about this all wrong, Alex said quietly, his voice still carrying a trace of the uncertainty that had lingered. We've been trying to live up to someone else's definition of what progress looks like. But why? Why can't we define it for ourselves? Rico turned to him, eyes softening. I've been thinking the same thing. Maybe all that noise, all that pressure, was just drowning out what we really believed in. We don't need to scream to be heard, Alex. We don't need to conform to be part of this community. The realization had come like a wave, slow and steady, but now it felt as though they were standing on solid ground again. They didn't have to fit into the narrow, radical box that Jordan, and so many others, had tried to place them in. Their activism didn't need to be loud or disruptive. It just had to be authentic. They had always believed in the power of small, everyday actions, and they could still make a difference that way. Change didn't have to happen all at once, and it didn't have to happen the way everyone else thought it should. Alex smiled, a small but genuine smile, as he turned to Rico. We can still fight for change. We can still be part of this. But it's our way. Not their way. Rico nodded, the burden on his chest lightening. And that's enough. It has to be. If we're going to make any real progress, we need to be true to who we are. The movement needs all kinds of voices, not just the loudest ones. There's room for us. In that moment, it wasn't about winning anyone over or being accepted by a single person. It wasn't about meeting anyone else's expectations. It was about owning their place within the LGBTQ+ community and finding peace in their own approach to activism. They didn't need to tear the world down to build something better. They just needed to live by their values, to advocate for equality, to make small, consistent changes in their lives and in the lives of others. The next day, they went for a walk through the park, holding hands, the world around them seeming a little brighter. As they passed a group of young people waving rainbow flags and chanting for change, Alex caught Rico's eye, and they both smiled. It wasn't the loud rebellion that was changing the world, but it was still progress. They had found a new sense of belonging, one that wasn't about fitting into a mold, but about embracing who they were and respecting others' paths as well. True progress didn't demand conformity. It demanded inclusivity, respect for diversity, and the understanding that everyone's fight could look different. And in that moment, they knew they had found their place in the world.